Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to the Medical Sciences Precinct at the University of Tasmania. It's great to have you here. I'm Larissa Bartlett, and I'm really on behalf of the university and like to welcome you to tonight's talk, which is called Managing Workplace Mojo. So this conversation is brought to you by our university's Island of Ideas public talk series. And the program holds a valuable place in the university's tradition where we connect with our community and discuss the issues and opportunities and challenges that we collectively face. We share ideas, research and insights from both the university and the wider community and from further afield. And tonight we're delighted to have with us an international scholar, visiting scholar, Professor Maree Roche from New Zealand, just to be an exemplar of that international collaboration. These conversations are a really important part of the university's role, which is about connection, collegiality and community, and they date back to our founding in the late 19th century. They remain core to our university's values. As we discuss community, leadership and values, we reflect on the deep history and culture of this island. The University of Tasmania wishes to acknowledge the traditional owners of Lutruwita, Tasmania, and the Muwinina people and the Palawa people. They are original and traditional custodians of the land that we're broadcasting from today in Nipaluna, Hobart. So we pay deepest respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and those who did not make elder status. Particularly today, we reflect on the past and future leaders of the Palawa people, grounded in thousands of years of tradition, knowledge sharing and understanding of this land. First of all, I'd like to welcome you to Menzies. Menzies has been here in Tasmania since 1988, and I don't know how many of you know the history of Menzies, but there's quite a number of quite good research discoveries that have come out of Menzies, which is primarily around population health. The vision of Menzies is to do internationally relevant research that improves the lives of all Tasmanians while we're doing it as much as possible. And some of those findings that have come out are around sleeping position with sudden infant death syndrome. We've had a 40-year running childhood determinants of adult health study, which has followed people for 40 odd years from childhood into their adult life. And now the research, the data that's being generated from that cohort is providing really valuable insights into what happens in childhood and how that affects our health as we age. And we've got currently, in more recent times, we've got a really wonderful team of researchers progressing our multiple sclerosis flagship research and also a cardiovascular flagship research. So there's a bunch of other research that takes place in the centre. That's just a couple of examples. But essentially we do at Menzies population health research because Tasmania's population is small and connected and relatively stable. And it's also well documented. So we have quite a number of large families in Tasmania that go back many generations. And we have documented health records since white settlement, which actually helps us to look at deep history of genetic and behavioural and other health factors. I also, before I keep on going, want to acknowledge the support that's been provided, particularly for workplace mental health research at the Menzies Institute through the Mind Games. Mind Games is a fundraising event that occurs each year and is huge fun. There's a great deal of teams of people who are competing against each other and building camaraderie, and they're also raising funds for workplace mental health. And I'd like to acknowledge Sherry Ring's presence in the room tonight and say thank you, because a lot of the funds that you raise make it possible for us to do the work that we do, so thank you. We're very delighted to have, as I mentioned, Professor Maree Roche visiting us from New Zealand. I'm going to give you a little bit more info about each speaker just before they speak so that information can hang together for you. But we'll be listening to Professor Terry Simpkin speak first, then Maree Roche, and then followed by Professor Angela Martin, who is from at the Menzies. So we're spanning business and economics, occupational health psychology and workplace mental health in this talk. So my job is to do a little bit of scene setting. So what I'd like to run through very briefly is what the mental health of working Australians looks like. We've got about 65% of the population in Australia that is working in one form or another. 20% of Australians currently have some kind of mental health condition. It's a common thing. These are the most common mental health conditions: anxiety, depression, and substance use. And these conditions all have stress as a common denominator. So there are other causes for anxiety, depression, and substance use, but there's a very strong common cause of elevated stress that contributes to people presenting with these conditions and having to live with them. Those conditions and poor workplace mental health and stress-related problems at work lead to these organisational outcomes. So we're looking at disengagement, antisocial behaviour, absenteeism, presenteeism, which is where you turn up to work but you're not able to function or perform as well as you might if you were feeling better. So we might be working at 80% of our capacity. Role adjustments, so we have to make accommodations for people who need those accommodations. Staff turnover, return to work planning, and compensation claims. So absenteeism on its own costs the country $4.7 billion each year. Presenteeism is more common than absenteeism and costs us more, $6.1 billion per annum. And workers' compensation claims that are related in some way to stress amount to $146 million per annum. So we're really, it's prevalent and it's costly. So just a very quick stress lesson. I'm sure you're probably familiar with this, but essentially stress is the natural response that we have as human beings when we're presented with a challenge, right? What happens immediately is our attention focuses on the threat, we monitor it, we experience emotional arousal and we have anxiety or fear, and our autonomic nervous system gets into drive mode and it's activated. So we have hormonal, we have hormones secreted, we have our heart rate and vascular flow changes so that we can have go and do the running that we need to do or the fighting, and our metabolic and digestive and cognitive and reproduction, all those normal functions that happen when we're at rest and when we're well, they get paused. So that's what enables us to do this fight or flight thing. But in fact, most of the time, we're not really racing, running from a bear. Most of the time, that automatic stress reaction doesn't really need to stay there. And it comes and it then goes again when we're not consistently facing threats. But if we are in a work environment, particularly where we're facing repetitive or sustained stress, it can lead to a condition called psychological distress, which is essentially a dysregulation of those systems that I was just talking about that are activated when we're experiencing stress. It also affects our ability to think and our emotional systems and leads to these common mental health conditions that I was talking about. And it also affects our health systems. This is one of the reasons why this whole thing about workplace mental health is here at the Menzies. We're looking at it as a health thing. It's not just a social problem, it's also a real health problem. So it does affect our physical health as well as our mental health. So workplace stress, to summarise, is prevalent. It leads to poor health and discomfort for people, and it's also disruptive and it's costly. Tonight, we're not really going to be talking about how individuals can deal with that stress. We want to lift the game and we want to look at what's causing the stress and what can be done in workplaces to make work less stressful for people. So this paper on this picture here on the left-hand side of the screen is of a white paper, a front cover of a white paper. There's a QR code here, which if you would like to scan it, you can download that white paper. It's been prepared by Professor Angela Martin and one of her PhD students, Adam Nebbs, again with support from Mind Games, which is awesome. And it provides a wonderful summary of what's currently known, current thinking and models around how to look at best practice around workplace mental health in organisations. And it's free and it's available and we want it to get as widely distributed as possible. On the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see there's a model. We've got kind of prevent harm, promote the positive and respond to problems. And in the land of workplace mental health that I've been involved in sort of the last 15, 20 years, the main focus has been on responding to problems when they come up, rather than looking at the other two very important levels around building capacity to do the work that you do without it taking pieces of you, and preventing harm through exposures. So we're really looking at an integrated approach to workplace mental health to shift the focus from it being the responsibility of employees to manage their own health and wellbeing to really resting with the employers as well as employees. So it's integrated, and we can have policies and procedures and practices that don't necessarily align with each other. So we're looking at this, at this sort of higher level. I am now going to hand over to the lovely Terry Simpkin, who's going to focus all of that conversation on a much more precise area, which is around imposter phenomenon.
I'm Terry Simpkin. It's an absolute pleasure to be here to talk to you about a topic that I find fascinating and horrifying in equal measure. How many of you have seen something like this in social media, in the newspapers? Shock, horror, insert celebrity name here, has been diagnosed with the imposter syndrome. How many people have seen that recently? Yeah, okay. If you're looking at the coverage of the Oscars, Billie Eilish apparently has got imposter syndrome. Princess of Wales apparently has got imposter syndrome. Michelle Obama apparently has got imposter syndrome. Every man and his dog seems to have imposter syndrome. What I'd like to talk to you tonight about is this thing called the imposter syndrome. I'm going to unpack some of the myths and mythology that underpin it, but also some of the gravity around why we really need to unpack this construct and look at it with the gravity it deserves, rather than the social media spin that it seems to have picked up over the last few years in particular. So let's have a look at some of the top 3 myths around this construct. I've only picked 3. There are a number, but sadly we don't have enough time to go into all of those today. So we'll look at these ones. So first, it's a syndrome. No, it's not. It's a female thing. You may have seen that women are more prone to be getting imposter syndrome than somebody else, and that's entirely untrue as well. And it's all in the head of the individual to deal with. And coming back to your point, Larissa, that we really need to be looking at this as more of a social and a workplace concern, and I'll unpack that as we go through tonight as well. So, top 3 myths. The first one, it is a syndrome. No, it's not. It has never been a syndrome. It doesn't appear on any lists of psychological syndromes. People often say to me, well, why, Terry, why do you get so exercised about this? It's just a name. But if people believe that it's a mental health condition, it sets up a form of stigma. If people feel it's stigmatized, they don't talk about it. If they don't talk about it, then they continue to experience the consequences of the experience. So it prevents discussion and it instills fear. So let's call it what it is. It's a phenomenon or an experience. It's not a syndrome. It is not a mental health condition, although it is associated with a number of mental health conditions, which I'll talk about in a minute. And there is no diagnosis. So this idea that so-and-so has been diagnosed and they're walking out of some nightclub thinking, oh, I'm very tragic. There is no diagnosis that actually comes along with this. There is a test. Actually, there are a couple of tests, but it's not a mental health condition. It's not a syndrome, ergo it can't be diagnosed. It comes with a suite of characteristics that people will experience on a continuum from very rarely to intensely. And different people will experience that differently in different contexts. So all of this talk about the imposter syndrome, particularly on social media, really is diminishing the importance and the gravity of the situation. If we're suggesting that everybody gets it, well, no, they don't. And you don't actually have it, you experience it. And it varies from context to context. So if that's not what it is, let's have a look at what the definition of it actually is. So the imposter phenomenon was first researched in the late 1970s by a couple of psychologists called Pauline Rose Clance and Susan Imes. And they came up with a definition that it is an intense feeling of intellectual fraudulence despite successes. So this idea that people are perhaps fishing for compliments or are not necessarily feeling as precarious about their own achievements as they actually do is quite false. We're looking at people here that have a track record of success, who are outwardly capable and competent, but are genuinely unable to see that track record for themselves. And that track record may well be overtly and objectively out there in the world, but they are unable to internalize that success. Instead, they will internalize their own perception of failure or setback or things not actually being as perfect as they would like them to be. All that belongs to them. All the success they achieve belongs to something else. I got lucky. I was in the right place at the right time. Congratulations on that job. Oh yeah, well, I was the last person standing, or I was the least worst candidate. All of those sorts of things contribute to this idea that success slides off like Teflon, but failure sticks like Velcro. And people who experience IP genuinely are unable to see their successes. We'll come back to that point in a moment. So what is it? It is characterized by these sorts of experiences. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just a representative list. First and foremost, people who experience IP are more likely to be perfectionists to the point of experiencing maladaptive perfectionism. That is pouring so much effort into something without much of a return, that they polish and polish and polish a project. They perhaps agonize over a piece of work before they actually let it out into the world, where in fact they're actually not getting any extra value out of that. And of course, that perfectionism often leads to burnout, stress, and overwork. Fear of failure. So this idea that if I fail on this, everybody's going to know that I shouldn't have been here, and that tap on the shoulder is going to happen at any minute, and I'm going to be called out for the fake and the phony that I actually am. So they're constantly in this flight or fight response, that not in the pit of their stomach waiting for somebody to tell them that they've actually made a monumental failure. The flip side of the perfectionism often suggests that because they put so much effort and work into projects or the work that they're doing, they're actually, as I've mentioned, high achievers. And yet there is a fear or an abject discomfort with scrutiny. One person in my research suggested I would much prefer to be an invisible first than a visible second, because the visible second is the first loser. So this idea that I want to be the best, not one of the best, the best, but I don't necessarily want the scrutiny that comes with it. Because with that scrutiny comes an expectation that I'm going to have to do it next time and the time after that. And everyone will expect me to keep being good, and I'm not quite sure that I can keep that up. Remembering that they can't see their past experiences of success. So they've got this fear or discomfort with scrutiny, and they're also internalizing failure, as I mentioned. But there is this idea that they want to be special or outstanding in some way, but secretly, so that I can ride underneath the radar without the expectation that comes along with being good. So the second myth there, that it's something that is more associated with a gender-bound construct, that it is something that is more experienced by women. That's absolutely not true. Research since the 1970s has shown that men and women both experience this, and indeed it's across all genders. The point of difference is much more important. So where somebody believes themselves to be other, so it could be gender, it could be sexual orientation, it could be social class, it could be a cultural background. Any one of those things could be fertile ground for a sense of otherness in a certain context. So some of the research that I've been doing is women in science tech occupations, so women in engineering, high achieving women in data centres, those sorts of things, where they are the only woman in the room, that is fertile ground for a sense of imposter phenomenon. Doesn't necessarily follow that if you are feeling other, that it will necessarily follow into IP, but it's certainly fertile ground for it. So men might experience it if they're feeling other, perhaps if they're men working in early childhood education, for example, or midwifery. Any point of otherness might be a cause for a sense of feeling like an imposter. I shouldn't be here. I got here by some process of luck. There's nobody else like me around here. Therefore, that's just evidence that I shouldn't be here. In terms of this idea being it's something that the individual has to deal with, is something that I've been challenging in my work. Certainly most of the work that has been done over the last 40 years has been looking at the prevalence, so how many people are experiencing this in certain contexts. Much more likely to come across that in the literature than any work around the social implications or the social drivers of IP. And certainly the early work that I've been doing identifies that it is essentially a triumvirate of things going on here, that there is a number of things that are bouncing off each other. So first off, we have this idea that how we see ourselves in comparison to others around us. What we have grown up with as part of our relationships with our parents, with our siblings. Have we been unnecessarily scrutinized as young children around being right? Or how many of us have perhaps experienced, I know this is my own experience, coming home from school with your report and it's a string of A's and then there's a B minus. Oh, that's very good, but what happened here? This type of narrative, if it continues over a period of time, instills a sort of response, well, I'm going to have to be perfect. I have to do better. It's nothing short of an A is actually going to be good enough. So we take this type of internal narrative with us into adult life. And so then that bounces off social structures, how our society sees us in comparison to other people. What are the social narratives telling me about myself and my place in the world? Where are the biases? How is our society or the community that I live in, how are they managing difference or diversity? So there's some work there in regard to how our individual view of ourselves out in the world actually bounces off what our world is actually telling us about ourselves. And certainly, in relation to what Larissa was talking about, this idea of workplace systems and processes. Certainly there is very, very little work being done in this space. There's a little bit more coming through now, but certainly historically, looking at how the workplace fuels IP through systems such as recruitment and selection, performance management, pay negotiations, succession planning, all of those sorts of usual structures that we find in the workplace are actually fueling this by virtue of putting people into a position where perhaps they are required to perhaps identify their track record of success. For example, performance management. You walk into the room with your manager and they're expecting you to say, well, look, this is what I've done over the last year. This is what I'm worth to the organisation. And perhaps even, can I have a pay rise? If you are unable to identify your own successes or where you're actually making a contribution to the workforce because you actually don't see it and you've offloaded all of that success onto extraneous things like luck or other people or being in the right place or the right time, it's going to be very difficult for you to make a case for your own performance management review and perhaps promotion and perhaps succession planning and perhaps pay rise. And indeed, one of the people I interviewed as part of my research suggested that she walked out of her pay negotiations £10,000 poorer than her colleague who was actually able to identify their own worth to the business. The tragic thing about that is that the people in those pay negotiations sitting on the other side actually knew it. And so we start to see perhaps how these things are playing out in terms of gender pay gaps and underrepresentation of certain communities in our boardrooms and in senior leadership. So whilst we might suggest that this thing exists up in the head of the individual, it actually has real consequences out in the world and certainly in our workplaces. And so the impact is real. And as Larissa identified, this idea of workplace health and safety and particularly mental health is being challenged by the way that we're actually interacting with our work. So IP has been associated with stress, burnout, self-handicapping. So particularly in where people are perhaps in a position where they may be able to go for promotions or get better jobs or to be paid more money, that they may actually be self-handicapping and not achieving the success or the potential that they actually are capable of achieving. Anxiety, depression, and of course from a workplace perspective, lower forms of productivity, and it can also impact workplace relationships. That is a truncated list. There are a whole raft of other implications for this, but we don't have time to go into tonight. So where to from here? I've got the privilege of working with some very excellent students. One's here tonight, Erin Buttermore, who's just finished some excellent research work on the association between IP and PSYCAP, looking towards a PhD program that's going to look at interventions. As I mentioned, whilst the research has been full of studies looking at how many people might be experiencing this and in what context, there is very little that looks at the construct in the workplace, and certainly fewer in terms of really concrete interventions about how the workplace can perhaps contribute to mitigating or indeed eliminating the sense of intellectual fraudulence in its staff. So we're looking at workplace systems and processes, leadership interactions, PSYCAP, as I mentioned, and Maree may well be talking about PSYCAP a little bit longer, in a few minutes. And of course, I have a PhD student who just submitted on psychological courage in the UK. So we're expanding our view of the construct to perhaps take in a more expansive view of how this is actually playing out in not only in people's heads, but also in the workplace as well. But for now, I'll hand back to Larissa. Thank you.
Wonderful work. Thank you very much, Terry. I'm going to introduce for you Professor Maree Roche. So Maree is a Professor of Management and International Business at the University of Auckland. Through her research, Maree continues to inform international and national audiences of the value of properly understanding and resourcing the mindsets of leaders and employees in today's complex, bicultural and changing business environments. Thank you, Maree.
Thank you very much, Larissa, and much like Larissa and has said, I'd also like to thank the traditional owners of this island for allowing me to speak today. And I'd also like to thank Ange, Larissa and Terry for welcoming me here today. My name's Maree, and all of that's true. I'm sure of it. But one of the things that I've got a real passion about, a real interest in, is the role of leadership in psychological well-being of employees. So I think we can all cast our mind back to a leader that we've had, or a manager that we've had, that was average to bad. Yes, lots of nods, absolutely. Well, they have a true impact on actually our own psychological well-being at work, our own engagement at work. But the opposite's also true. When we have a leader that is psychologically resourced and really understands what good leadership is, they have a real benefit on employee well-being as well. So I could have said that 2 minutes and I'd be done, but I am an academic, so I'm going to take 20 minutes to say that to you, because, that's what I do for a living. So in defence of our leaders, in defence of our leadership, leadership actually today is a hugely complex role. It's one of the most complex and stressful roles that you can take on in an organisation. It's a role where leaders are often being told, here's less, now do more, and we want you to be a positive leader as well. What we know is that that role is hugely stressful. We know, for example, that there's less people being born, particularly in New Zealand, so there's less people applying for work, less people in the workforce. So leaders are having to do more with employee development, with less people. One organisation that I've worked with has 5 generations of people within the organisation. So we're expecting leaders to be able to relate to a number of different generations and expectations and needs of those people and bring them forward. We know there's economic instability, for example. We know, for example, that even the social instability and political instability changes and has an impact on what leaders can and do. And there's also this environment, I'm sure you've heard of it, the VUCA environment, that we're more working these days in a volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous situation where what we did yesterday and the ideas that we had yesterday and our ability to solve problems yesterday won't do us in the future of leadership. So I guess I'm here to say that we need to think about we need to actually think about leadership and resourcing leadership and the leader's role a little bit differently when we're thinking about the psychosafety and the well-being of employees at work. So research tells us, I've told you this already, but I'm just going to say research tells us that leadership is a stressful role. It's one of the most stressful roles you can take on. And stress reduces performance. This is what Larissa and Terry have talked about. Stress reduces performance. But here's the kicker, and that is that leaders who are under stress directly impact the burnout and stress of their employees. Their behaviour changes, right? It's a no-brainer when you start saying it, but their behaviour changes, and that impacts on the well-being of employees. And more recently, a lot of the researchers in leadership psychology and leadership development are talking about how that complexity and stress is not going to slow down anytime soon. In fact, that role is just going to get more and more stressful and more complex. So really, we like to think of ourselves as this nice sort of calm person over here talking away, but within the mindset, if you like, the psychology of leaders, it's quite overwhelming. So just to pick up on what Larissa was talking about, the physiological insights into stress, what happens to us when we're under stress? We know that leaders are under all sorts of stress in an organisation. And we also know that there's huge expectations on them. And what we do know is as we're under stress, more and more stress, that stress actually starts to take over the way we see the world. It shuts down our ability to think. And stress actually encourages us to be more stressful, to ruminate more on what's wrong. So I'm just going to do this little thing. Why don't you touch the back of your head? No, don't feel shy. There you go. So this part of your brain, as Larissa talked about, we're governed by fight, flight, and freeze. And this part of your brain actually covers the fight, fight, or freeze default mechanism that we have. So in this part of your brain, you share this with your favourite jellyfish. This part of the brain is shared with just about every living mammal that there is. Fight, fight, or freeze. It's our automatic response. This part of the brain was developed tens of thousands of years ago to keep us safe, to run, to fight, to freeze. But it's our default mechanism. In stress, what we do is we start to engage that red part of the brain, the back part of our brain, and it starts to shut down our ability to think, to reason, to have empathy, to develop relationships. And what it does is it creates a stressful environment. So leaders start to kind of dig down to figure out what they need to do. So instead of looking up for new ideas, digging down. But here's the kicker. This is not a picture of my ex-husband, by the way. Here's the kicker. Oh, good. Here's the kicker. It actually manifests in our behaviour. So it's not just like I'm fighting, running and freezing in fight mode inside my head. This is exhibitive behaviour that we have when we're under pressure and under stress. And leaders obviously start to engage in this sort of behaviour. It's kind of like a cognitive load that goes with that role. The more that we're engaged in something that's stressful and more stressful things that come in, the more we narrow down, the bigger the cognitive load, the less we can handle more cognitive loads. So we've only got a little bit of behaviour, a little bit of mindset left. And that's problematic for employees. So it's not just like I like leaders, but it is problematic for employees in the psychosocial environment because really clearly there's some really good research that demonstrates that leaders' moods are contagious throughout the organisation. And so leaders, yeah, I know, scary, eh? Leaders' moods and behaviours are contagious and are picked up by employees. And then they start to kind of play on employees' thinking of the situation of leadership, of what the leader's doing, and starts to impact on their own behaviour. So there's a couple of ways that leaders' moods and emotions are contagious. The first one is that we're wired to look for threats ourselves, right? So I'm looking around this room thinking, who's a threat? And we're wired to look for threats ourselves. And so employees are often looking at leadership and those in those positions that make decisions and kind of looking at whether or not what they're doing presents a threat for them. And so if I'm like this all the time, it's called emotional mimicking. You can actually pick up that I'm stressed out. And because we like to invent things, right, employees, we start to think, maybe it's my job, maybe there's something I don't know, and we start to kind of feel that as stressful ourselves. The other part of the contagion is behaviour. So when you're walking around looking like my ex-husband, there you go. That's quite like that. You like my humour. Most people don't. But if you're walking around looking like that, that behaviour is contagious. You think, here you go. What a bully. How many of you have seen your leaders as a bully? And how many of you have thought maybe they're stressed out? Probably not that many. What a bully. The other one is that it's associated to is ranking our leaders as abusive, for example, or ranking our leaders as disinterested. So actually, then we also start to pick up on their behaviour as well. So it's not just the moods and emotions, it's that behaviour starts to get rated by employees as abusive leadership, and you start to, it creates a really, bad psychosocial environment. So here's a study that we did, just so as you know it's real. We got leaders to rate their own stress, how stressed they were. And then we got employees and we matched them. So if any of you are stats people, you'll love this, it's multi-level stuff. We matched them to employees' rating of that leader's ability, and they rated them as abusive and bullying, for example. And then a little bit later, we also got employees to rate their own depression and burnout and stress in an organisation. And we found that model. And that model's been used a few times. And if you look up there, you'll see that only a little bit of buffering was employees' own mindset, was their own mindfulness, was their own psych-cap, was their own psychological flexibility. So while I'm an advocate for all of those for employees, actually that environment that leaders set is hugely predictive of their mental well-being and the environment of their well-being at work. So, but there is good news. Because I like positive psychology and positive leadership more, and that is that we can actually start to engage the thinking part of our brain, and we can actually start to calm the rage, calm the stress and those sorts of things, but it's active work that leaders need to undertake, active psychological work that leaders need to undertake. So what we know is if we can drop the anchor in thinking and what's going on in our thinking, I hope you're enjoying that. That took me like most of the day to organise, but it's a few synapses for you. There'll be more. There you go. So what we do know is that if we can drop the anchor or create a reflection in leaders or an ability in leaders where they can see that I've gone into like narrow thinking and behaving like a bear, if we can do that, then actually what happens is this whole change of mindset for leaders. So what is the research that we've done? We've found that if we can take leaders through interventions and different studies and develop some mindfulness work with them, and I know Larissa does a lot of mindfulness, and that's quite a prescribed process as well, that actually creates cognitive pause that enables far better decision making, and far better uptake of behaviour, recognising that. We've done the psych cap as well. So as Terry talked about, psych cap is our hope, efficacy, resiliency and optimism, all four of those together. When interventions are done in the leadership role, where their psych cap is developed, they're rated higher by employees as open leaders, and that has a benefit on employee wellbeing as well. So here's study 2. This is a good one, study 2. Well, they're all good, but you know. This one is on leader mindset, and I think Larissa's going to run us through a short mindset mindfulness thing, right, a bit later. Yeah, so this one is on leaders' mindfulness. So we got leaders to rate their own mindfulness at a particular time, and we replicated this with psych cap as well. So rating leaders rating their own psych cap. And then we found that we got employees to rate their leadership effectiveness. And leaders were seen as more autonomy supportive, more servant-like, more ethical, and more authentic in their leadership. So if you're into leadership, you know that that's really good stuff, and you know that is really good stuff. And then we rated that in relation to employee outcomes of engagement, of citizenship behaviours, of intentions to stay within the organisation. And we found that. But the hard thing is, for us that are interested in psychosocial environments, the hard thing is that it's much harder to switch from, read as your default. So fight, flight or freeze, that's our default mechanism. We go to that automatically. It's really important. Sometimes we've got to get things done, but that's our default. And we're fighting tens of thousands of years of default with your favourite jellyfish. But actually to move into this frontal thinking, to move into thinking, to clearing the clutter, to being aware of what we're saying to ourselves, to be thinking about, as Terry talked, you know, what other people are bringing into the leadership relationship and how we need to understand them, to actually move in and to click into this, what I've called the blue, takes a lot of work, And so it's not a simple, easy recipe. It needs much more work, much more research, and much more intervention for us to really fully map it. So I'll leave you this one from Mother Teresa, and that is, you know, if we really want to have organisations that are flourishing and safe environments, one of the areas, and the area that I look at, is really around the way we resource our leaders and the way we understand the impact of our leaders and their own mental health within workplaces as well. And I quite like the saying from Mother Teresa, you know, if you want to keep the lamp burning brightly, you must keep putting oil in it. And we do know that the leadership role is really taking a lot of oil out of our leaders. So kia ora, thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you all later.
Wonderful, Maree. Thank you very much. I love that PsyCap. It's psychological capital. It's a wonderful, wonderful construct. Just for those of you who have not come across it, it says hope, optimism, resilience, and self-efficacy, and all four of them are equally important. But when they work together, they're great. It's greater than the sum of its parts. So it's really, really interesting. Thank you. Wonderful. All right, so we're going to skip along. I'm going to introduce Professor Angela Martin, who is a research fellow at the Menzies Institute for Medical Research in Work and Mental Health. Angela's early research focused on industrial and organisational psychology and environmental factors that support adjustment to change in workplaces. She's also now very well known nationally and internationally for her research on mental health in the context of working life and for developing psychological management capabilities in organisations at all levels. Let's introduce Ange. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Some of my favourite faces out there. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much to the three of you and for keeping you interested for all this time. I'm going to try and be quite brief, and my role is sort of like to bookend the talks tonight by telling you a little bit about some of the research that we've got coming up that we're very excited about, and also just to share, I thought I would share 3 slides diagrams with you that I think create a lot of insight in this area without having much time. Okay, this one is from one of my papers, 2015, when starting to try and understand this concept of workplace mental health from a multiple level perspective. So Larissa said, you know, when we sort of started thinking about mental health in the workplace, a lot of it was about responding to distress or supporting people with mental health conditions to remain employed and to contribute. But, you know, what we need to think about more, I feel like there's been a real imbalance, and that's come through a little bit with some of Larissa's comments, is to think about the different levels of our environment around our working lives that affect us. So at the broadest sort of level, it's our labour market, the environment, and this is where our industrial relations policy and things like that sit. So things like job security, for example, when it's policy-based and not an organisation's employment condition, that can, you know, have a big trickle-down effect on workers because insecure work is one of the most identified risk factors for mental ill health. So, you know, that's just one example. Things like the level of unemployment or employment and sort of your ability to gain work or maintain work can really impact on your mental health. The next level is the organisation that you work in. So here, what Maree was talking about with leadership is a really good example, who your executive, your board, the sort of values and culture that they are, you know, trying to build in the organisation. And that creates kind of like a climate, if you like. It can be called psychosocial climate, but that occurs at sort of that broader level. Things like the meaning of the work that you do, like what are the things that the organisation delivers? You know, do you have a strong alignment of your values with those of the organisation? If you do, then that's quite good for mental health. But when the opposite occurs, and you're being asked to do things that are sort of against your values and beliefs, this can be a source of what's known as moral distress. So there are lots of examples that sort of sit at that policy and practice of the organisation level. And then when we think about our workplace, we mainly think about our work unit. So the people we work with every day, who our immediate boss is, you know, do we get along with other people in our team? Or is there a lot of conflict and animosity and competition in the team, which can then, of course, create a risk factor because those sorts of really stressed out work groups have much higher rates of things like bullying and other kinds of incidents and grievances. Again, they affect our mental health too. And then at the most sort of proximal level, it's our job and our job design. We all do different types of jobs. They all have different characteristics. And, you know, it's not just all about our pay, obviously. We go to work for a variety of reasons of what interests us, what we're good at, you know, what sort of skills we have. So at the job design level too, our mental health can be very affected. So something like shift work is a job design element where there's a stack of research about the impact of that on health and mental health. So we need to think about workplace mental health as about these things more than about how you might cope with stress at work. That's relevant, definitely. I'm not saying it's not relevant, but I think there needs to be much more focus on these broader social structures around us. And the job design stuff is a really new and exciting area of research. So I just wanted to mention those. The next circles picture, and all my pictures are circles, is the biopsychosocial model of mental health. Now, some people be sort of fairly aware of most of the things that are up on the screen there. If I say, you know, a common question is, well, what causes depression? You know, it's a big question. So my answer would be a combination of biological, psychological, social and environmental factors. And then you can obviously break it down further from there by looking at what's in that circle. You know, the psychiatry and medication and biological side of mental health is very prominent. So again, if you ask a person on the street, they'll say, oh, things like genetic factors or, you know, there might be something that happens because someone's got a physical illness, and the depression is a sort of secondary manifestation of a physical illness. Drugs and alcohol being discussed, they're sort of in that crossover between biological and social. And in certain industries, there's a lot of drug and alcohol use to cope with the stress of the work. If you think about the psychological circle, again, when we think about stigma of mental illness, people go to that section and think that, well, they must have bad self-esteem, they've got a personality that, isn't very conducive to being mentally well. There's a whole range of things, they should just kind of get their shit together and, go to therapy and then they'll be okay. That's the sort of psychologistic fallacy, I think, is the academic word about that. Those things, of course, are relevant, and they're all things that, we can intervene on as well, which is when you go to a psychologist, you're kind of working a lot in that space. But the green circle is the circle that really interests me the most, just because when we're academics, we can study whatever we like. I like to think about how we connect socially and, our broader environment as to a really strong influence on mental health. So we know if there's stuff going on in our family, that's really hard, and that can really affect our mental health. There's stuff going on at work, and that's what we're here to talk about. Lots of interesting stuff can go on at work that really affects our mental health, both positively and negatively. It's always really important to know that, there can be really great examples of people recovering from mental illnesses through having the right kind of employment, feeling really well adjusted and supported, and just making a great contribution. So we need to remember also the socioeconomic part of this puzzle, because we might be working in certain types of roles that are well paid and have flexibility and, allow us to do things like run off to a doctor's appointment if we need to and catch up later. But there are huge segments of our population who have no flexibility in their work. They don't have the trust given to them by their managers to allow them to have sort of a bit of discretion over how they do their work. There's a whole range of different sorts of circumstances that people can be in their working lives, which are really quite miserable. And they're doing it for a very, very low rate of pay. And in some cases, we've seen pay not go up for a very long time while the stress has gone up as well. And there's an imbalance. So I think those circles are all things that we can all relate to from our lives as things that have impacted our mental health. And it's always this sort of, interactive process that's going on. It's never just one thing. As I said, I'm really interested in what's in that green circle around work. And you can easily apply this to educational environment like a school as well. So thinking about how, school leadership and structure impacts students in the same way as it does for employees. And the last circle, this is one of my favourite papers that sits behind, it's just one of 50 years of research that sits behind some of the new psychosocial code of practice. I don't know if everybody's aware of that, but in the white paper that Larissa showed, I did that towards the end of 2022 because we knew those regulation changes were coming, and to try to prepare the business community a little bit for what was coming up, and for people to think in the community about what their role might be. If they're in government, what's the role of government? If they're a leader or a manager, what should they be looking at? And, if they're an employee, educating yourself about these sorts of issues is empowering. So this systematic review paper by Sam Harvey at the Black Dog Institute in New South Wales, the paper is called Can Work Make You Mentally Ill? And the conclusion from the huge amount of research that they reviewed is yes, it can. And the three big sort of factors, again, are imbalanced job design. So I mentioned things around working hours, level of job demands and stress, lack of value and respect, where we get bullying, we've got sexual harassment. Relational justice is just that feeling of being treated fairly by the people you work with. Occupational uncertainty is a big one. So a lot of these factors, as I said, 50 years of research to go into why are they having a code of practice on managing psychosocial risks at work. The Productivity Commission in 2020 says we've got to look at this workplace stuff. because, as Larissa said, it's costing big time. And on the other side of the dollar signs are people, and families and communities. So we need to get this stuff right. So I like that one. If you're ever trying to convince leaders that we have to look at this, besides telling them there are now regulations in place where WorkSafe can come and see how you're going with managing your psychosocial risks in your workplace. So that might motivate leaders to take action. So as I said, my key message is about keeping balance in the idea of individual well-being and health. Very important. Our responsibility as employees is to be fit for work, up for work, do a good job, and we need to be healthy to be able to do that. But on the right-hand side is this institutional, organisational responsibility. Now, we've heard about social responsibility in terms of the environment and the climate, but it's also in terms of humanity as well. So this model on the right, I just put there to illustrate some of the really positive things about work that, if it was very well designed and managed, could boost our health and well-being to keep that balance. So opportunities for growth, feeling like you matter in the workplace, having a voice, feeling like you're treated fairly, being protected from harm. We can't prevent all harm. We have people working in high-risk occupations, social services and policing, emergency services, all of those, there is a risk of physical harm, but even just in general office workers have big risks for psychological harm if their job design isn't healthy and their environment isn't healthy. So we just want to keep that in balance because everyone wants to go to the easy fix of individuals. And the other thing that I like about working on the environmental side is because you don't require the employee to do anything to improve themselves, because they're going to just subtly get this benefit of a good environment if you're doing a good job of managing that. So they don't have to sign up for anything. They don't have to go and exercise more. Like, those things are all good to do, but the organisation needs to be doing their piece to sort of boost the effectiveness of those individual strategies. Otherwise, they feel very cynical about it. As you know, I often play a jokey sort of clip, but I haven't got time for it tonight. But it's where there's the stressed out workers and the manager comes in and says, "Oh, we've got a wellbeing webinar on today," and they all go, "Oh," and they go, "Well, I don't really have time," or So just illustrating that sometimes that cynical response is justified. They're just a few of my key points that I wanted to make. And now for translation. So, as Larissa said, I've been doing this for quite a long time now. Going back to 2017, the integrated approach on the left-hand side, that was the first white paper where I met Maree, came over, and we had a great time and came up with this concept. And we sort of put that integrated approach out there of prevent harm, promote the positive, and respond to problems. Since we did that, it's been picked up everywhere. We're really excited. We're cited in the World Health Organization Mental Health at Work guidelines. I've been working with the Australian Public Sector Commission, helping them develop their own model for Commonwealth public sector employees. They also include 3 sort of enabling factors in addition to that preventing harm, positive, and responding to problems part, by looking at leadership and governance, looking at data and monitoring and evaluating and improving what you do, and also thinking about building literacy and developing capability. Because, again, what Maree and Terry are talking about is management capabilities and knowledge that helps in all of this sort of stuff that I've been talking about. We've also got picked up in the National Mental Health Commission's Blueprint for Mentally Healthy Workplaces. So just to show you that, we start working on something, the paper's in 2014, over a long period of time, it has impact in the public. So what we did with the white paper, I was just having a look at it because it was at the end of 2022, we said our key priority in our research group is to establish some data of a baseline of capability in Tasmania around workplace mental health. What are employers doing, if anything? Where are the pockets of, emerging good practice that could be shared? So we said we wanted to do this big study. Turns out that we're about to sign a contract with WorkSafe Tasmania to do that study. So we're really excited. We thank the Mind Games for giving us the opportunity to produce that white paper as an influencing document, and it seems to have worked. So we're pretty pleased, and we'll tell you very briefly what we're going to do. So what we're trying to do is sort of map a snapshot across Tasmania, so it's statewide. We've got 2 surveys that will be going out. One is a key informant survey of employers. So we're trying to get a systematically representative sample so that the conclusions that we draw are pretty robust. And then we'll be doing an employee survey as well. We want to break it up by small, medium and large, but Larissa just informed me today that there's only 65 large, so we might have to put the medium employers in with them. But the thing that's really of interest in my very first project was how small businesses deal with this stuff. Like, we've got this list of 14 psychosocial hazards, and someone running a cafe is expected to know, are their staff experiencing these hazards? And if they are, they have to document controls that they've put in place to try to protect them and reduce the risk. So it's a very big new area. It needs a sort of a baseline first, which is, one of the reasons that we're doing this. So we're also hoping that, you can help us as we get prepared to recruit people for the study, that you can spread the positive word about why we're doing this and you can participate yourself. So that's what we'll be doing. So we're doing the study first, the surveys, and we provide a report to WorkSafe. Then we do an evidence review to try to match interventions and practices to the gaps that have been identified, and if possible, some industry context kind of studies, like what do we know that works in construction, for example. And then we produce a blueprint at the end that goes out to everybody, all the employers and employees in Tasmania, and says, here's our sort of best advice about how to handle these issues in the coming years. That research will keep emerging, and the practice side of things will keep emerging too. So it's kind of still in the bit of a puzzle, but we're glad that it's happening. So that's basically the project. It will spit out, this is an example of data from New South Wales where they've tried to undertake a similar thing, but it's sort of saying, are we at the stage of, basic awareness in our organisation, or we've got an intention to do something, but we haven't really started yet. We're doing a few actions, or actually we're doing quite a few, but effective, and then very few. In New South Wales, it was 8.8% that sort of fit that best practice kind of judgment. And then you break down by regions, by business sizes, looking at the strengths and weaknesses of what's being done. We'll be able to do a lot with this map. Now, you've been listening to us for a long time, so I thought we'll go into our panel mode shortly, but as we're doing that, maybe just chat to the person next to you about one thing that's resonated with you personally, of anything that's been discussed tonight, and maybe what you see as a big priority for building this mentally healthy workplaces in Tasmania objective.
I'm going to invite you now just to take a little moment, just to maybe drop in, and this is a little mindfulness thing. I'm just going to invite you to do a little reflection just on your own. Perhaps if you're open to it, just dropping the eyes and just tuning in to the fact that you've got your feet on the floor, bum on the seat. You've got this torso that's kind of rising up out of your pelvis, and a shoulder girdle that's sitting on top of your torso, and head and neck. We've got this body, it's sitting here and it's breathing. Just notice that there's breath that's coming in. There's possibly some movement in the body that you can feel associated with your breath. Just invite you to reflect for a moment on what brought you here today. What matters enough to make you turn up on a Wednesday evening and listen to a bunch of academics speaking? Maybe also reflecting on what you might have learned out of the talks today. There might be one or two key thoughts that are bubbling up for you, or not. And allowing thinking just to take a back seat. Remember this body and this breath. We're still here. And come back into the room, and we'll open up to some questions.
Hello, my name's Alex, and for context, by day I manage a small television newsroom. Thank you all. A lot of that really resonated. I have a question about imposter. We're not calling it syndrome. What are we calling it? The experience, right?
Imposter phenomenon. Yep.
The phenomenon.
Experience. Yep.
So I definitely don't have it myself, but I can understand why a lot of people do, because I don't really understand why so many people you meet are so reluctant to encourage and heap praise on other people. It's almost like if they are forthcoming with praise, and somehow that diminishes their own performance. I see it in a work sense. Daryl, who's here, and I both amateur stand-up comedians. I see it in a comedy sense, other performers being very reluctant to heap praise on someone else, even though they just knock people's socks off. And I see it in even things as trivial as playing golf, where you play with someone and they'll be so reluctant to congratulate you on something good. They'll put it down to luck, or they'll say something sort of, passive aggressive rather than actually heaping praise on you. So I'm curious as to why that exists. And then for someone like me who doesn't have imposter syndrome but wants praise because it feels good to talk about something you've just achieved, and you want that reinforcement that you're on the right track, sometimes you'll feign imposter syndrome just to start that conversation. You'll say, "Oh, were you sure that I was okay?" Or, "You sure that went well?" And then at least that opens up a conversation, and you have that sort of really positive reinforcement that what you just did was good. So I guess that's my question. And could we diminish the prevalence of imposter syndrome just by being a bit more encouraging?
There's a lot to unpack there, but no, it's fine. I'll get to the response. So, imposter phenomenon or the experience is not about not giving people praise or recognising their achievements or acknowledging their success. It's much more the person who has that success is unlikely to internalise it. However, if a person experiences IP and has their own discomfort with praise, people in my research, one woman put it really beautifully in that she said that when people give her praise, or in a work situation, in say getting feedback or performance management, she had her toes curled. So she has this physical response when they're actually receiving something good about them, because there's this deep discomfort with being told that they're actually good at something, because there's the natural response to sort of push it away onto something else. So it could be that the individual is expecting other people to feel that same discomfort and is therefore not wanting to put you in a position of discomfort. So that, I'm not saying that's what it is all the time, but certainly, there is this other thing where people just don't like to big other people up because it diminishes their own capacities. I can't give you praise because it's a zero-sum game, and therefore if I give you praise, I'm diminishing something about myself. That's not IP. That's some other thing.
Lack of self-awareness.
Lack of self-awareness. There are a number of people in the public eye that perhaps have lack of self-awareness at the moment. We won't talk about that. The other point that you were making around fishing for praise, again, people may not be giving it to you because they actually feel themselves that they're sparing you the discomfort of actually receiving that praise. And it often happens with parental relationships, that if a parent has experienced IP, then they may well actually pass it on to their children, and so it becomes a cyclical generational thing. So, but there was a lot to unpack there, but I hope I've given you an answer. Yeah.
Thank you, Alex. I'm going to go online now, and a question or a comment from Maree. The concept of contagious leadership really resonated with me. I can see it happening and spreading on a daily basis in a whole bunch of different ways. How can we negate their damaging behaviours? I really struggle a way to see through it most days.
Kia ora, thank you for the question. And I think, like everything, it's a long-term process, actually, not a short-term process in terms of understanding that the importance and antecedent of leadership, thinking and behaviour on employee well-being. I think, firstly, when we become more aware that as an employee, we're really gauging our leadership for their mood, for example, and we're quite susceptible to that mood. And also we're looking at their behaviour as well, and we tend to kind of really internalise that behaviour as well. That's not to say that we should put up with it, but it is to say that that sort of self-awareness becomes one of the first ways that we can start, putting up a bit of a defence for ourselves. The second way is, of course, advocating for the type of recruitment, selection and performance management of good leadership. And this one interesting fact I find is that when organisations have poor or bad leadership, most often what they will do is promote them somewhere else. And I think that's a really interesting long-term issue as well. Thank you.
The old sideways move. Yeah. That's probably not a laughing matter at all, but yeah.
It's one of those quick answers to an immediate problem that creates a whole, raft of
there's
issues.
such a power imbalance in that situation too, because if the leader has no self-awareness and they're the leader, protecting yourself is pretty much all you can do.
Exactly. And then that's really depleting for the employees. In fact, what some of the conversation we have had is that that responsibility for well environments is not necessarily with the employee and them managing themselves. It's kind of like, giving, blaming the victim in a way, which is unfair.
Thank you for the presentations. I'm interested a bit more sort of bigger picture. I'm going to use the COVID word. Where does research now sit in measuring leadership and change in a workforce since COVID is now in significant change, and also in terms of future, in terms of industrially we're going to 4-day weeks for many organisations and businesses as a promotion, but also in terms of those organisations still separating their staff from working from home and going back to work. And where will this sit in terms of, say, contemporary research now and then measuring it pre-COVID? Because I think these are major influences in terms of next generational leaders.
A massive, massive issue that I'll try to unpack in 30 seconds or less. And it's not easy because I am an academic, but absolutely you're right. One of the huge areas of stress and issue in the leadership landscape and organisational landscape is, on one hand, the return to work and work being social. On the other hand, acknowledging that technology and COVID has disrupted what happens within workplaces and how we lead traditionally in workplaces. And also that the ability for employees to have that autonomy to work the way that they want to. So those three things are colliding a lot in the research and the literature. And it's absolutely a huge area. One of the areas of research that my colleagues and I have looked at is how we create good relationships with employees who might be distant or online, because we don't get that nice kind of nuanced look and those sorts of things, and how we can develop those types of different ways of relating. And so that's a huge area of development and growth. But yes, absolutely. We've had a massive, the size of the Industrial Revolution or bigger in terms of how workplaces operate and lead in the future of workplaces because of COVID.
But just very quickly, many of those things were already on the agenda before COVID. COVID just amplified those things. And certainly with talent shortages, labour shortages, skills wastage across many, many industries, those organisations that fail to provide flexibility or workplaces that are meeting the needs of individuals, those individuals have other places to go. So that's been shown in the research that individuals are leaving.
There's quite a good evidence on that. I've seen it presented at a few conferences, but also we've got AI and automation coming. There's all sorts of different discussions about living wage and reducing the number of days. But yeah, the research that I've seen on 4-day-week trials is generally very positive.
We've also had the rise of the gig economy and so on. So there's, the shape of work has changed so dramatically in the last 20 years, since the turn of the century. There's a question here that taps into that, which I'd like to read out, and that is, what does the role that technology plays? So technology can relieve stress and build positive culture when it's used well. Yet on the flip side, it can also create stress and frustration. For example, too many emails, platforms. Is there much or any research in the role of technology in supporting positive cultural workplace change? I added the cultural bit in there. That was cheeky.
I reckon there is, but I don't feel expert enough to comment on that.
And neither do I, but I will. Sorry, can you delete that?
You'll have a crack.
I'll have a go. Yeah. There is, like these pockets of research. So, for example, people who have rosters that encourage, like Saturday night and, antisocial hours, they feel better about the roster when they see it as being generated automatically, as opposed to part of somebody doing those sorts of things. So there's some interesting things in there around how technology can create a sense of fairness and equity. Just as much out there that sort of talks about how it's going to pose some real issues.
Hi, thank you for tonight. The insight has been fantastic. My question's for Ange about the benchmarking activity that you'll be doing down here. I was just wondering if that would also include capturing the experiences of employees who have had to leave a workplace, in addition to if they're experiencing difficulties or negative environments currently. If they feel, they've had to leave, will that be included in the study?
Well, the employee survey will be open to any working adults, basically. But if they're unemployed, they may not be captured specifically in that way. But we are thinking about also including volunteers, and so it's potentially, if they're working somewhere, we can capture them, and we will be having some opportunities for people to put qualitative information. So it's possible those sorts of cases may be commented on in the survey. But yeah, generally in HR, they should be doing exit interviews and finding out the sources of the reasons people are leaving, and then attempting to, remove those problems or deal with those problems. So yeah, it's not what's actually happening in practice. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for the comment. And it's true, because people do leave because they've been bullied, they've had traumatic experiences. They may not make a workers' compensation claim because, that may further damage their mental health, is what we know about those processes. So they just leave quietly, and the same thing happens again. Yeah.
It's a good question worth us pondering, though. We are still in planning stages.
Yeah, we've got, and that's why we sort of wanted to put that question out there for you. We haven't got time to hear from what you want, but if you would like to email us with ideas or suggestions, things like that, and what you think is important, we'd welcome those.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a question from Lauren. Thank you, Lauren. How do we find the line between unreasonable and reasonable requests for accommodations for employee difficulties at work? So both as an employee trying not to ask too much but get the support that's needed, and as an employer. It's probably for you, Ange.
Yeah, I think the reasonable accommodations idea comes out of the disability and human rights legislation. So, mental ill health is a condition that applies to requests for reasonable accommodation. I think it is a really interesting question about where the line is, because you employ people to do a job and they need to be able to do the job that you've employed them to do. But the idea of reasonable accommodations is, tweaks or changes or flexibilities that you can put into place. Again, it's going to come down to having to be approved within that organisation. Some organisations are very supportive about accommodations because they've got a policy about mental health and inclusion, and so they see the benefits of making those accommodations. But from the point of view of the employee asking for support, that can be difficult. Again, coming back to that issue of power. And if you don't feel like you're in a psychosocially safe environment to request support and flexibility, that could be, really challenging for that person. But it is your right to request.
And your responsibility as an employer to look after the whole person that you're employing, not just the person that while they're in their job. And I guess that taps into, the skills of leaders to be able to know the people that are working with them and know them, understand, as real people, not just people, bodies filling tasks, and the skills. And that's really hard to do when you're the bear. And so those, the importance of addressing these conditions that can come up and present real challenges for leaders in our workplaces and for people that are working to navigate on a daily basis how to flourish rather than just to survive. And really we should be looking at that and looking at how organisations can step up a little to really embrace that responsibility. And we find it really exciting that the guidelines that shifted from it's recommended you look after the mental health of your employees to it's now required. And what that is leading to is a whole bunch of questions out there in employer land. What does that actually mean for me? What do I need to, please explain. And so we hope that this survey, this study that we're doing is in the process of doing the research going to also be a bit educational for the people that are participating in it and help clarify some of these new terms that are coming up in the employment landscape. On that note, I think I might thank our wonderful panel for being here this evening, and all of you who have come in person and all of you who have shown up online. Thank you very much for spending the evening with us. Our next presentation, which is coming up, I believe, next week, Thursday, the 21st of March, which is on antibiotic Armageddon. Do we have hope? That's the title of the talk. I'll read it out. So, in the microscopic realm, an ongoing battle unfolds against antibiotic-resistant microorganisms. Successes with life-saving antibiotics are countered by concerns and misuse of these medications, and it increases the threat of superbugs. So find out how we might help build a healthier future and combat this threat from our leading AMR expert, Professor Tim Walsh, who I'm delighted to say also is my brother-in-law. He'll be coming from Oxford University, I believe, and to give this visiting talk. So we're very excited to have Tim come out to the Menzies and to the University of Tasmania. And on that note, I'm going to say thank you.